Disclaimer, I'm a law student, and the legal information provided is not legal advice. For that, please hire an attorney. That's some good tea there. All right, what do we got next? Oh, fuck. I'm not sure how much I want to go through this. So, obviously, we're not going to watch the entirety of this video. But I want to talk a little bit about Joe Rogan. All right? So, Joe Rogan recently platformed, or recently had on one of his videos, someone named Abigail Schrier. For people who have watched my content, you'll remember that in one of my recent videos I covered, Abigail Schrier was on a video, or was on Ben Shapiro's show, all right? And effectively talking about the same thing that they talk about in the course of this video. So I'm going to play a little bit of it. I'm not going to get too deep into it because I've already sort of like addressed the arguments that she makes, but this is more about sort of like talking about Joe Rogan as a personality, and that's what I'm a lot more interested in.
Hello, Abigail. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Thanks for doing this. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Irreversible damage, the transgender craze seducing our daughters. Boy, that's a hot button subject, right? This is a minefield.
It shouldn't be, though.
No?
Yeah. So this is what they go on to talk about. Again, we're not going to talk about the entirety of the hour and 45 minutes. But I'm going to summarize for you, all right? Because I'm going to make this video a little bit quicker because actually there's another video by Joe Rogan that I want to watch that's more relevant to the discussion I want to have. This video is not about debunking her arguments or her book, all right? We already addressed them in a prior video. If you want to go watch that video, then I would advise you to look at my channel. It's one of my recently uploaded videos, all right? What she argues essentially is that she adopts this idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria. She argues prescriptively that we should not be using gender affirming care with children who say that they are experiencing gender dysphoria. And she talks about problems with trans ideology and how they apply to how children are being treated in regards to trans medical care, right? If you want my specific arguments about that, then you can both go to my research document, which has pretty extensive areas on those particular subjects. And you can also go watch my prior video, and I would advise you to go do so. All right. What I think is more interesting about this, all right, without getting too deep into it again, I'm not going to scrub through it because it's an hour 45 minutes. Abigail Schrier is able to get away with a lot of shit in the course of this video, right? We'll listen to a little bit of it just to give you a feel for it. But Joe Rogan really doesn't push back too much on any of the subjects, and I think that we'll see that. Let's fast forward a little bit just to get into the meat and potatoes of it.
You don't destroy the biological function. Like, I didn't become a doctor to destroy someone's biological function for, something that they've decided they have without
great place to jump in.
Not even, any oversight or... But the ones who do it say, look, this population is really desperate for surgery. It's a civil rights issue. If I'm giving them what will seem to bring them comfort.
Mind you, also, again, I'm not going to berate it too much. There's plenty of empirical evidence to show that doctors aren't prescribing surgery to children, right? They prescribe it to whoever they think is of such an age where they can actually consent to a serious surgical procedure, right? So first that. Secondly, there is mountains of demonstrable evidence to show that gender affirming medical care has overwhelming beneficial effects on the lives of trans people, both adult trans people and transgender youth, right? So let's just nip that in the bud right there, right? So she's taking an anti-science position fundamentally when she's arguing this, right? People who just talk about how they're concerned about doctors prescribing surgery to people, right? Those are largely self-contained within the medical community. Doctors are regularly self-evaluating and making sure that they're only doing what is medically safe and necessary, for trans people who are pursuing medical assistance.
The problem is that there's no follow-up to see how their mental health is afterwards.
Yeah, there are. Hold on. I wasn't prepared for this, but I think that I actually have research on this. I mean, like, here's an entire section on, like, how much, like, to the extent that gender affirming care actually helps people. I want to look for a specific longitudinal study. Oh, hold on. This can go to the conversation on detransition. So that's actually what I want to go to. Right. The systematic literature review of all peer-reviewed articles published in English between 1991 and June 2017 that assesses the effect of gender transition on transgender well-being. Cornell University found that regrets following gender transition are extremely rare and have become even rarer as both surgical techniques and social support have improved. Polling data from numerous studies demonstrates a regret rate ranging from 0.3% to 3.8%. Regrets are most likely to result from a lack of social support after transition or poor surgical outcomes using older techniques. Furthermore, a survey conducted by the National Center for Transgender Equality found that detransition is largely due to social pressure, and over 60% of trans people who detransitioned, it was only temporary. So let's be clear. There is longitudinal data on this. We know that the vast majority of trans people who transition are overwhelmingly satisfied with the results, right? And if people do choose to transition, it's largely because of something that has to do with like the quality of their surgery, or it has to do with societal influences. That's it. All right. So let's not pretend that there's no longitudinal data on this, because there clearly is. I'm not gonna, again, like, this isn't really like the point of this. Like, I can go through and debunk pretty much every one of our arguments, as I already have in the previous video, right? But that's not the point I want to get to with this.
The surgeon is basically a mechanic, right? They just remove the tires and send you on your way.
Yeah, the problem is we're not cars, right? It's all connected. So unfortunately, very often the mental health deteriorates. I mean, I talked to one young woman, Desmond, who's amazing, and she decided in high school she was trans. She got celebrated everywhere. Her teachers, her therapist told her, yeah, you're definitely a man, you're supposed to be a man, affirmed her everywhere she went. She got on testosterone, and it caused uterine cramping, which can happen. It's one of the many bad side effects of testosterone. She had to have a hysterectomy. So at 21, she wakes up with a hysterectomy, and she realized this whole thing had been a giant mistake.
Yeah, so that's, again, I don't know how much I want to take her at her word, but yeah, shit happens. This is anecdotal evidence. This is not evidence against the prevailing scientific literature that transition and gender affirming care overwhelmingly helps trans people. Usually, and I love that usually the only thing that these people are able to cite is like specific anecdotal evidence instead of like actual peer-reviewed literature.
Her mental health had not improved at all, and this was a huge like mistake and path she had gone on, and all of a sudden she didn't know what to do. There was no one cheering her on anymore.
Okay, so something interesting. I haven't watched all of this. Let's pay attention to specifically how Joe Rogan responds to this, right? Because this is anecdotal evidence. I think it's very easy to like respond to this if you have some wherewithal and you have some knowledge about this. I just want to pay attention to how Joe Rogan responds, all right?
Why do you think people get cheered on for this decision?
Let's talk about that question. He doesn't push back against that particular instance. It's not like he pushes back against like the idea that this happened, or the idea that like this somehow discredits gender affirming care on a categorical basis, right? He isn't pushing back on this in a lot of other ways that people reasonably could in the circumstance. He just kind of goes with it, and he asks like a follow-up question, assuming the validity of what she said, and actually like extrapolating a little bit, because he takes this beyond a specific circumstance, and he talks about, why do you think that people affirm others in this sort of a way, right? Like, he talks about it beyond just this particular person, right? And that's sort of the problem with Joe Rogan, right? Because at the end of the day, like, I'm not sure, like, I don't think that he's a bad person, all right? I don't take Joe Rogan to be, like, a very bad person. I think that he is a very misinformed person. But the reason why, all right, 9.7 million people. Fuck me. The reason why is because he recently put out a video that I want to talk about a little bit.
Hello.
Recently, Joe Rogan also had on the show Ben Shapiro. I'm not sure how much you all are familiar with this conversation that happened, but I remember watching a little bit of it when I was on Twitch the other day, and I was like watching, I think it was like the Surfs were watching it. So I was watching it through them watching it, which, you know, all good fun. But it was kind of amazing because there are many points throughout this discussion Where Joe Rogan, I mean, mind you, the conversation is largely about systemic racism, right? And like racism in America. And like Ben Shapiro makes a lot of arguments like against systemic racism, and he makes a lot of arguments like against systemic poverty and like BLM and all of that, right? Like he makes, the standard Ben Shapiro like super conservative take, right? But like Joe Rogan really pushes back against him at like multiple times. I'm just fast forwarding to a random part, but I want to see if we can get like a little bit of that just for like an example.
And yet it immediately turned into, who can we blame? Who's to blame for all these dead people? Maybe it's Ron DeSantis, or maybe it's Cuomo. Like, who can we blame? So that was terrible. And then on the Floyd stuff, I had the same feelings. Like, I don't know a single human being who watched that tape and didn't think, okay, that guy deserves to go to jail. Chauvin, right? The officer in that case, in the George Floyd case.
Didn't think that, yeah.
Everyone I know, every single
yes.
person was like, yeah, that's real bad. Like, cops. Like, I know tons of cops. I'm friendly with tons of cops. And not one of them was like, yeah, that's good police procedure. I'm glad he did that. Like, no one thought that. And so when people are like, okay, well, we're going to look at police brutality, maybe we'll take a look at qualified immunity, maybe we'll take a look at police unions and the kind of restrictive covenants that they have with the cities, and how we make sure that everybody knows who the bad cops are so they can't get hired at different places. Like, all those are solutions. But they quickly turn from, well, we don't want to talk about solutions. Solutions are a bad idea. What we need to do is we need to shout about everything we can possibly imagine all at once. And you know what? Instead, let's have a conversation about, like, was George Washington a bad guy?
That's a straw man. I literally have conversations about all this every day in the course of my work, right? And among people who I talk to, and among you all, right? Stay tuned. Again, the systemic racism and the police brutality, those arcs are coming in the future. Planned content for later on in the summer/fall.
Guy. Let's have a conversation instead about, like, just completely defunding the police. We want to have, like, a responsible conversation about things that make sense. We'll talk about, like, what if we just got rid of the police?
How crazy is that discussion? That discussion, when people are really saying defund the police, I'm like, cooler heads will prevail. But they're going to realize. And I think they're realizing it now in New York City. I mean, New York City has had record crime, record homicides.
Who would have thought?
Who would have thought? De Blasio is, I mean, I would have never imagined I would look at Garcetti and go, well, he's better.
Yeah, he's just kind of going with it.
Have capacity, temperature checks, do it right. They're doing it right in a lot of places all over the country. We can do this. The audience has to wear masks. This is totally doable. And so they were right about to do that. And then this other thing is, we were trying to figure out, like, is it protest only? I think it's bars too.
Yeah.
The thing about bars is close talk. People are
and
drunk.
Loud talk,
yeah, they're drunk and they're on top of each other.
This isn't great because right now he's kind of going with whatever Ben is saying, but we'll find an example.
Kind of, yes, except that the NBA is not racist because obviously it benefits black people, right? I mean, now, the NBA is not racist except it's because of meritocracy is the reason the NBA is not racist. Right. But Robin DiAngelo and Kendi both suggest that meritocracy is an aspect of whiteness. They say that meritocracy and individual are aspects of whiteness because these institutions, things like meritocracy and individualism and not seeing people's colors, these just reinforce hierarchies that end with disparate outcomes. And so what they say is, in order to be anti-racist, you have to want to tear down the entire system. They literally say this. I'm not really, I know that I'm not misidentifying the argument because I've read their books. The basic notion and that no progress has essentially been made. If there is progress, it's mostly a lie. And so every disparity now can be attributed to historic disparities between white and black.
Is there middle ground?
Okay, so I think that we're getting into the conversation. That's a good example, right? I think, like, if we're getting to where I think we are, this might be a good example.
If we look at 1776 and we look at the Declaration of Independence and we look at America today in 2020, there clearly is some impact in the echoes of slavery and then after that Jim Crow. There's clearly some impact in these deeply impoverished communities that don't seem to advance.
Yes. So to make the argument about institutional racism, there's a couple ways you can read this. When people say systemic racism or institutional racism, I usually ask them to be a little more specific in what they mean, because there are a few ways you can read that. One is history has impacts. Of course, that's true, right? That's true for everybody. It's true in your family history. Right? If you have a grandfather who went to prison on a particular charge, that leads to poverty for your parents, which led to more poverty for you. Right? People have histories. Those histories are embedded in their life experiences, and that's true for societies as well. All of that is for sure true. Then there's the question as to whether the institutions today are racist, and that's not quite the same thing, right? Because history has consequences is not the same thing as saying the rules today are racist. Because the rules today are not racist, actually. The rules today are quite not racist. So,
but
again, we will cover this on another day, but that's not the point of the video.
Historically, it's fairly recent. If you go from the civil rights movement to 2020, we're really not talking about that much time. We're talking
3 generations.
50 plus years.
60 years, yeah.
I mean, it's 50 plus. Right, in the world of,
in the vast span of human history, it's not
a very small amount of time.
Right.
So clearly there's some impact of both racism and then Jim Crow laws. So that's what...
That's an impressive... Again, I think that this is an impressive pushback against Ben Shapiro. And I wouldn't normally expect it from Joe Rogan. But I think that watching the rest of this, I think it's actually pretty impressive to see Joe Rogan try and like actually push back against Ben Shapiro, because I would have never otherwise expected it.
Where I'm saying there's a middle ground.
Yeah, and it is important for people on my side of the aisle, conservatives, to acknowledge and recognize the importance of history in people's living situations now. And it's important for people on the other side of the aisle to, at the same time, not attribute every single thing to history. Because
right, but isn't there always something like that? There's always like extremes on each position, and the truth lies somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, but I don't think that it lies as far in the dead center of that as people, I think, want it to. What I mean by that is the problems that have plagued communities in the United States, not just the black community in the United States, but problems of racism or problems of sexism. The way those get alleviated is people making better choices over time. Right? That is the problem. That's the way that those issues get alleviated. When Jews arrived in the United States in the early 20th century, to talk with my people, when they came, they were impoverished. They didn't speak the language. They were banned from country clubs. There was open discrimination against them. They were banned from Harvard. Right? Harvard Law School had quotas on Jews. The way to fight against that is to make good decisions. And so you fight against the system to make sure that the system has rules that apply equally to everyone.
Right.
Again, there are obviously responses to make, but I will just let Comrade Joe take it from here.
But you clearly see that there's a big difference between people coming over here willingly and doing so in order to better their lives versus someone whose ancestors were dragged over here to be sold as property, and then dealing with the repercussions of that being your family history and red line laws and all the other things that were put in place to sort of keep them in very specific areas, which to this day remain crime-ridden, gang-ridden, deeply impoverished communities.
Well, that's true, but the question is how much of that is historic redlining and how much of that is an 18-year-old kid today deciding to pick up a gun and shoot somebody.
But how much of that 18-year-old kid today deciding to pick up a gun and shoot somebody is based on him growing up in this fucked up environment where that's what he models, where everything around him is crime and gangs, and you imitate your atmosphere, which is what all humans do.
Right, but the answer is there's
Wow. Actually, I'm going to keep playing. I want to keep watching. I won't belabor it too much, but like, wow, is this completely unexpected, right? Like, is this completely unexpected? And I suppose that this is sort of like the point that I want to get to in the bit. Like, this is really what I want to get to. This is my opinion on Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan reminds me a lot of people who I grew up with. I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up around a lot of other, in fact, I'll go full screen for this. I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up around a lot of people who are very similar to him, especially in personality, the way that he talks, the way that he thinks. And like, I get them, all right? And it's really hard for a lot of those people. And again, like, this is something I have to work on every time I come home. But this is something very hard for me that I've noticed, is that like, whenever I go home and I find that I'm probably drifting further left politically than a lot of people who I grew up around, I can't really talk about politics that much because most of them take sort of like this enlightened, I don't want to say enlightened centrist, but you know, like kind of everyday man sort of centrist view that Joe Rogan does, right? Especially some of my closest friends who I grew up with. And that doesn't mean that they're conservative. That doesn't mean that they're even reactionary. That doesn't mean that they're fascist or whatever. They're just not like, they're not knowledgeable about some particular issues, right? Like when we're talking about Joe Rogan talking to Abigail Schrier, throughout the vast majority, if not the entirety of this thing, he basically never pushes back against her. Again, she's objectively wrong. If you want evidence for that, see my research document and see the prior coverage I have of her. And the thing about it is that, like, I'm pretty genuinely convinced that he doesn't push back because he's trying, like, he takes this position that he's trying to learn more about this subject. And he's learning from, like, literally one of the most biased fucking people on, like, this particular subject matter, right? Like, he's literally listening to someone who published a book called, what is it, like, Transgender Craze? Like, you know, not exactly the most objective and neutral source of information, right? Do I hold that against him? Do I think that he did that intentionally? Normally, I would speculate more as to whether or not he was. But, and maybe this is like the intention of this. Maybe this was like, you know, planned by him. But I don't know. I get more of an impression that he just genuinely doesn't know as much. And because he doesn't know as much, he's just not able to push back against someone like her. Which honestly, it's like low-hanging fruit, right? Like, she's not Ben Shapiro, and even Ben Shapiro, I think that if you are decent enough with rhetoric and you know what you're talking about, you'll be just fine. But like with her, and like the distinct lack of evidence that she provides, or what small evidence she does provide, being completely biased and anecdotal, it's not exactly hard to challenge her if you know what you're talking about. And here, it seems that Joe's actually like done some homework and actually kind of knows what he's talking about. And so it leads me to believe that he is a lot better of a person and a lot more like more genuinely objective than I might have previously believed him to be.
Only one way to break that chain.
What way is that?
That way is to not pick up a gun and shoot somebody.
I think that's a simplistic way of looking at it if you're on the outside of that community and you're not one of those 18-year-old kids that grows up with the incredible influence of all the people around him, and that's all you see, and that's all you know.
Well, But the problem is the only way that's going to be the thing that your kid doesn't know is for you not to do it. At some point, personal agency has to come in.
It does,
because
but education, and teaching them about personal agency and letting them understand that there's a way out of this and that the path that they see being replicated over and over again by these people that wind up dying young, that wind up going to jail, that there are other options. There's a lot of kids that never get that other information, or if they get it, they get little blips of it, but the vast majority of the information, the vast majority of the influence they get is terrible.
Well, I totally agree with this, and this is why I think the worst thing that you can say to a kid is you're born behind the 8 ball, and no matter what you do, you're not going to succeed.
Yes,
right? That's literally the worst thing you can say to a kid. What you should be saying is, look at how your grandfather was born behind the 8 ball, and look how hard he had to work in order to get ahead. And look at all the
That's true, though. But if your grandfather wasn't ahead, didn't get ahead, if your grandfather was in and out of jail, if your father was in and out of jail, everyone around you is like that. If there's literally no influence that's positive in your life, the idea of saying to a kid like that, hey, don't pick up a gun and shoot somebody, that's way too simplistic a version of their future, in my opinion.
I'm going to advise that people go watch that because it's a really good interaction. All right? This is not a video talking about the merits of systemic racism and police brutality. Those will come in the future. All right? So stay tuned. And hey, subscribe to see that when it comes out. But just to like give my 2 cents on Joe Rogan, without rehashing it too much, essentially this is where I'm coming at it from. I think he tries to be a good person. I think he has a giant platform because a lot of people can relate to him. A lot of people like who I grew up with. And I can see why. He thinks like the average person. If I might speculate a little bit, I might say that he has very similar appeal to people who are like ages like 30 to 50, as like PewDiePie has to a lot of people who are like young and edgy gamers, right? He's relatable to like a vast number of people. And relatability, I'm gonna make it prescriptive. I'm gonna give you my hot take. The people who do best in YouTube are the people who can relate the best to their audience, right? And the people who audiences can best relate to, you know? And yeah, he's certainly gotten popular because of it. It's hard to deal with though, knowing that he has this large platform and that he does end up, probably because he doesn't know any better, end up platforming people who have like pretty fucking bad views, right? Like, let's be clear. He ends up platforming people like Abigail Schrier, like Ben Shapiro, like pretty often, right? And like the amount of time that he platforms people who have like more progressive or left-leaning views is like pretty rare. Do I think that's intentional? It's hard to say. But like based on at least this interaction, I can't say it conclusively. And I don't know. It made me respect him a lot more. Like, he made arguments that I don't think I could have made it better if I tried. And yeah, gotta tip my hat to it.